Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Welcome to 2022, my first review of this new year. And today I'm going to be taking a look at a lens that I looked at in another mount for another type of system previously. But circumstances have led me to revisit that. Most specifically, I'd really been looking forward to the RF 100mm F2.8 macro IS, great, a great lens on many levels. But if you watch my review of that lens, you knew that I ended up being a bit disappointed in, number one, above all, in a bit of a focus shift problem, in the somewhat gimmicky SA control, and then also the price point having continued to climb. And so I've long considered that lens as maybe a replacement for my long-standing EF 100mm F2.8L macro lens, a lens that I have really loved. So after that lens proved to be, unfortunately, a little bit disappointing, I began to think about, how about taking a fresh look at the Laowa RF 100mm F2.8. This is a 2x macro. It's apochromatic. I knew from doing my review of the EF version that it was a lens that had a lot going for it optically. However, some of the liabilities of a manual focus only lens on a DSLR system means that, for macro, not such a big deal. You could do it in live view, but for other kind of applications, some of the other things that are fun to do with a macro lens, it was less flexible for that. And so anyway, I thought, considering that the new, Canon RF lens runs around $1,400 US, you can get this lens for $500 US, and it comes in a native RF mount. I thought, why not take a look on it on the EOS R5 higher resolution body and see how it plays out for that. So here we are, and I'm going to give you a not terribly long review because I'm not going to cover all the ground that I did previously, but I wanted to dive in and take a look at what's changed and to give you my direct feedback on how I enjoyed using this lens on a mirrorless platform as opposed to back on the DSLRs. First of all, however, a word from our sponsor, Phantom Wallets. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from a bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code Dustin15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So we're going to start by taking a look at a few things that have changed, because while this is the same lens in its overall design and optical performance, what I reviewed before, there are a few tweaks that come when you move from the DSLR to a mirrorless mount, in the overall length of profile and a few features that change. So let's dive in and let's quickly chronicle those things. So the basic lens profile is largely the same as before. This is a long and slender lens. Not exactly what I consider to be the most graceful aesthetic, but obviously they're packing a lot of focus travel in an internally focusing lens. And so that's part of what contributes here. There's actually some additional length in this section to accommodate the difference in the flange distance of the mirrorless mounts like this or the Sony E-mount relative to the DSLR mounts, where because of the mirror, the optical path is a little bit closer and can recess some into the lens. Not the case in mirrorless. So overall, the lens is actually a little bit longer. It is fairly long. It's 155 millimeters in length, but only 72 millimeters in diameter. So there's more kind of disparity between those figures than what you would typically see. Now, a few differences relative to the Canon EF version that I reviewed. First of all, only the EF mount, for some reason, has any kind of electronic contacts. It also had electromagnetic aperture iris, and that seems to be pretty much the only time that Laowa has done that. So we've got a nice metal lens mount here, but what we don't have is any kind of electronics. So this is a fully manual lens. It has a manual aperture ring here. This is not declicked, though I will note that the detents are fairly light. You can feel them, but you can basically smoothly go through it. Not quite as smooth as a declicked aperture, but I think you could still probably get away with that if you wanted to do something like that. Aperture ring does its job. The focus ring has moves very nicely, though as I noted with the EF version, the focus throw could be a bit longer, particularly for a lens that has such a huge amount of close focus possibilities. But the feel of the focus ring is really excellent. It's nicely damped. The only time I actually felt like I needed more focus throw in this application was actually at landscape distances, because you can't just go right to the hard stop and be properly focused. You can focus a little beyond infinity, which is pretty common. And so I did. That's the only time I really felt like I needed any help with that. But of course, focusing on mirrorless with so many more focus aids, actually much more thoroughly enjoyed the whole focus process. Now, some of the kind of lens quirks remain, and that is that still, as a part of this design, there's actually a UV filter that is on the front of the lens that actually serves as basically the front element here. And so you can screw that off. You could replace it with a different filter. However, the lens is going to be less sealed without that in. So it comes including that. That's actually part of the overall design of the lens itself. And so anyway, I don't necessarily love that design, but it's functional. The pinch cap here works as normal. The actual lens hood is one other place where I don't love the design. It doesn't, for one thing, that is a problem. It doesn't fit well with both those things, but it's gotten better as I've used it. But it is not a utterly precise process in mounting and unmounting the lens hood. Like I said, it's gotten better. The tolerances have gotten better with use, and so it's less of an issue than when I first got the lens, but something that to bear in mind. One other thing that does vary in these depending upon the mount, and so in this case it's a positive, and that is that we end up with, in this aperture, although it's now a manual aperture instead of electromagnetic like on the EF version, you actually get more aperture blades. So a very high count of 13 aperture blades gives you a nicely circular shape as the aperture is stopped down. So that's a positive there. And then as far as the overall weight here, we are 638 grams, or about 1.4 pounds. And so the lens, it's got some heft to it, but neither is it particularly heavy. It's not unusually heavy relative to other macro type lenses. Now you can focus as closely as 24.7 centimeters, and of course you do get your 2x magnification there at that point. So as far as the physical design, it is a nice design. Laowa lenses are very nicely made outside of the lens hood, which is nothing special. So I like the overall build. There is no weather sealing. There's no electronics here, so it's somewhat bare bones in that design. But what you've got here is very well made and very functional. And of course, for a macro lens, it's less of a liability, I just find in general, particularly on the mirrorless mounts where the focus aids make focus, in most cases, pretty much a joy to use. I'm actually enjoying using the lens, and I prefer to use manual focus anyway, up close, and so having a nice manual focus ring and good precision there certainly helps with that. So as far as the actual use of the lens, before we talk about the optics, let's talk about the use here for a moment. Because as I noted in that hands-on section, I actually found the lens in this application to be more fun to use. Now, I did, when I tested the EF version, I did use it adapted some on like a Sony a7R Mark III, and obviously there are things that I enjoyed as a part of that. However, you're having to include an adapter into the equation, and so a few extra quirks that come with that. In this case, however, I was able to, on the ES-R5, I could set the focal length, and so that I could have in-body image stabilization, very, very nice. And then, of course, the various manual focus aids. And even better than on the R3, I should say the A7R Mark III, on the Sony side, the Canon EOS R5 is a real joy to use with manual focus lenses for a couple of reasons. The in-body image stabilization is one, but it also has a really fantastic both viewfinder and then also LCD screen. And so the byproduct of that is that I find manual focus in either application to be easier than ever, because if you magnify the image, there's lots of resolution there, so you can still see things really crisply. Also, I find that the EOS R5 and Canon in general is doing a really nice job with how focus overlays work. And so when you have a really sharp, high contrast lens like this one, it actually makes it easier to focus because you have really crisply delineated focus overlays. And so, for example, if you're using a white or a red overlay to show focus, I find that it really is quite precise. Byproduct of that is that I really nailed focus easily. and actually found that I only needed to magnify focus in some rare situations. Now, one of those, as I detailed, is when shooting at infinity. And so, for example, the focus overlay led me to believe that this image was in focus, when in fact it wasn't. And so I found that I did need to magnify image to visually confirm focus at landscape type distances, and so I could get better results like this one here. So overall, I actually really enjoyed the experience of using the lens, and I don't really consider its limitations to be overly limiting on mirrorless, because you get the in-body image stabilization. That helps with, one disadvantage relative to the far more expensive RF 100L macro lens. Being able to have a really good focus ring and the great attributes of the camera body that make manual focusing much more of a joy also helps to solve those problems. And so at the end of the day, I didn't find myself being overly limited, particularly, as I said, because of the fact that I actually prefer manual focus for macro type work or even up close work better anyway, because you don't have to worry about getting a focus point in the right place or making sure the focus system grabs what you want. You just do a quick twist and get it to where you want. So it worked really, really well for that. And as always, optically, this lens is really fantastic. We'll detail why here. So first of all, this is a 2x macro lens. And so just to give you a quick illustration of that difference, here is 1:1. Here is 2:1 type magnification. So obviously that is very, very useful. To give you a sense of how that compares to the Canon RF 100mm with its 1.4x magnification, which is itself better than the typical 1:1 magnification, you can see that 2:1 is a significantly closer focus than and higher magnification than what you see on the Canon RF lens. So as noted, this is an apochromatic design, and one of the huge advantages of apochromatic lenses is the just incredible control of chromatic aberrations. And so in this kind of high contrast scene, all of this bright white and this really unique pattern of this dried, it's probably just a weed, but it's interesting nonetheless. But you can just see that even at a pixel level, 45 megapixels of resolution, you're just not seeing any fringing at all. And obviously that's going to add some huge value to the lens. That does bear out when compared to even a very good optical lens like the RF 100L. And so you can see if we jump into a pixel level here that the better chromatic aberration control means that you can definitely see some fringing here on these really highly reflective metal surfaces of this key. And as a byproduct of that, you can see some fringing even as you begin to transition towards the bokeh on the RF lens. You'll see that the Laowa lens stays completely neutral, no fringing there, but then also no chromatic aberrations, no fringing that you can see here. A secondary benefit of this, particularly when it comes to macro work on these kind of shiny objects, is that you actually get better contrast, which you can see that although the RF lens, it looks very good, the Laowa lens looks better still in terms of being able to render fine details without losing any information to fringing. Now here's a quick look at uncorrected and then corrected raw image off the lens. And so you can see that there is a mild amount of pincushion distortion and definitely some vignette in the corners. My manual correction required only a -3 to get rid of that pincushion distortion, so no big deal there. More significant is the vignette, which I needed to move up to a +62 to eliminate here, as you can see. Both of these figures are slightly more significant than what we saw on the RF lens. It only needed a -2 to correct for the distortion and about a +43 to correct for the vignette. So somewhere around a half stop more vignette on the Laowa lens and just a hair more pincushion distortion. So let's take a look at how this all shakes out in terms of resolution and contrast then on again, this is a 45 megapixel EOS R3 sensor. This is 200% magnification. In the center of the frame, you can see that we have got fantastic results. Very sharp, very crisp, very high contrast. You can see that moire pattern that is coming because of how high the resolution is. We can see that the mid frame is also excellent, just a little bit worse than what we saw in the center of the frame. You can see also an excellent result here and off towards the edge. However, if we look down into the far corner, the far corners are good, but you can see that there is a little bit of regression in terms of overall acuity relative to what we saw in the center and the mid frame. So going back for a moment to the RF lens, let's see how that compares. So in the center of the frame, you can see that the Laowa actually has a little bit more sharpness and contrast. You can see that Mar pattern is present here, but not on the RF lens. And so you're going to see a little bit higher sharpness in the center of the frame. In the mid frame, the results slightly, in my eye, favor the RF lens, which it's showing a little bit more advantage. That advantage becomes slightly more pronounced if you look down here into the corner, where the RF lens definitely shows better acuity and contrast in the corner of the frame. And so trade-off there is the Laowa's slightly sharper in the center of the frame, but starts to lose out the further you move off axis, where the RF lens becomes the sharper. And you can see that's true up in this corner as well, where this is a good result, but this is a great result. So if you stop the Laowa down to f4, you can see there's slightly more contrast in the center of the frame, nothing significant there. There is a mild improvement in the mid frame, and we can see that definitely there's better contrast in the corners, and though I wouldn't say the acuity has really gotten a lot better yet. Stop on down to f5.6 for a little bit more acuity in the corner of the frame, and more still at f8, where at f8 I consider the corner to now look really excellent. So how about at macro distances? Well, here at f2.8, we can see at a pixel level that you can easily see all the fibers that make up the weave of this bill and the various ink spots. Very, very high acuity, and we go from this level of detail here in terms of this is 1:1 at a normal chart testing distance. This is how high of a magnification you can achieve at 2:1, and so obviously that is really significant. Now, where this lens shines to me is actually out in real-world images, where that really great contrast that comes from being apochromatic allows it to really kind of show out here. And so you can see just this image here that you've got just great just contrast and overall punch to the image. Now, in this particular image, you can see, because we're fairly close, that the bokeh is nice and smooth. There is a tiny bit of a vulnerability with apochromatic lenses when it comes to that in some situations. If I move back a few feet, for example, you can see that this background is maybe a little bit busy for your taste. Obviously, bokeh is a subjective thing, but it's not as creamy as what maybe you would necessarily like. Though in most situations, I thought the bokeh quality was really quite good. You know, here, for example, obviously, nearer to macro distances, the background is just completely blurred out. That's often going to be the case for you when shooting with this lens. Even at more medium distances like this shot, I just, although this is arguably a boring subject, you can just see that the amazing contrast and punch from the lens allows you, number one, to have amazing looking textures. But even as we look towards the out of focus, it's not completely obliterated in terms of creaminess. But I also think that the overall look of the image is compelling, even though, this was a somewhat boring subject on a pretty flat day as far as lighting. At macro distances, this lens really shines. Just as you can see, it's able to really deliver detail. And obviously at f2.8, the plane of focus here near to 2:1 magnification, it's just tiny, razor thin on this coin. But you can see all along what is in focus, you can see that there's just great detail and no aberrations that diminish that detail. Here's another example, a fairly small needle poked through a spindle of thread. And so you can see, here at macro distances, just amazing detail in the fibers that make up, even that little bit of thread that is there. And obviously the needle looks huge. That's the advantage of being able to have such high magnification. One final observation, and that is when working at more, moderate distances, I was able to focus quite effectively, and as you can see, the detail and the contrast is really fantastic. You're able to just delineate really fine details, and so I do really like the optics of this lens. It's just very flexible in terms of its magnification, but that apochromatic design means that there's lots of punch to both the contrast and then the color and contrast combination makes it a special lens. And so while I wouldn't say this lens is as good across the whole of the frame as the RF 100L macro, it's a hair better in the center of the frame. And when it comes to real world results, I think that this lens outperforms its chart testing because it has such low chromatic aberrations, and that apochromatic design really helps images to pop. And so as a byproduct of that, I ended up really continuing to like the look of the images that I took in a variety of situations. And I know from my review of the EF mount version that this lens also produces really snappy colors because of that having such high contrast, and very often that is a strength for apochromatic lenses. They really have great color pop because of that amazing contrast and just the nature of the optical design. And so here's a few of those images from the EF mount to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. I had the good fortune of reviewing that lens in a more colorful season than what I'm reviewing right now at the in December and early January. But as a byproduct, if you are looking for a macro specific lens, I think that this continues to be an excellent choice in the RF mount. For one thing, that price point is really attractive, has a higher degree of magnification. It has an apochromatic design that really produces more punch than even what the RF lens does, although I really like the look of images from the RF lens, and so I don't want to downplay its optical qualities, which are excellent. But you also don't have to deal with that focus shift type issue. And if you prefer to do manual focus when doing macro type work anyway, not really a liability, some of the limitations of this lens. So it could be a lens where you could save a lot of money and still really like the end results that you get. So if you have been debating on what macro lens to pursue, I really don't see a lot of reasons to recommend any other lens than this one, unless you specifically need autofocus or image stabilization in the lens itself. Some of those attributes that the Canon has. Weather sealing, this lens does not have those things. But if you think you can get by without those things, this is a great alternative at a really great price point. I would say amongst the Laowa lenses, this is one of the best bang for buck lenses that they make, and so well worth your consideration. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my text review of the RF version, and also linkage to an image gallery if you want to look at those photos. There's also linkage there to purchase one if you're interested, in some various links that help to support this channel without costing you anything. And beyond that, there's linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media. You can check out our new channel, Letthelightin TV, which is tech and video, so check that out. There's also linkage there to become a patron or to purchase some of my merchandise. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Be sure to ring that bell so you get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.